So, the first episode of FLCL Progressive finally aired recently. This is one I was simultaneously curious and skeptical about. Here is a 100% true fact about the Omni viewer. FLCL is the series that got me into anime. It's true. I've spoken with people who are much bigger anime fans than I am who said that if FLCL had been their first exposure to anime, it would have scared them off. But not me. No, I'm the guy who saw those 6 episodes of weirdness and finally had it click. I'd known about anime before, of course, but I just never got into the series that were the popular ones. Didn't really like Pokemon, Digimon, or any of those Mon series. Never got into Yu-Gi-Oh!, really didn't like Dragon Ball. Yet one night I just happened to catch the beginning of a full FLCL marathon on Cartoon Network, or more appropriately Adult Swim, and I stuck around for it, and what do you know, I liked it. That was what finally convinced me that there was more to anime than just what I had seen up until that point. So yes, FLCL does hold a special place in my heart as far as that goes. You never forget your first anime series after all. So you can imagine I had a few mixed feelings about the idea of getting a sequel. Now, of course, we've gotten the first episode of that sequel, and well, my skepticism hasn't quite faded yet. This first episode of Progressive is the introductory one, of course. This is where we meet our new main character, Hidomi. Unlike last time, this FLCL is being told from a female perspective as opposed to a male perspective. However, Hidomi has a very similar base as Naota. She's still the disenfranchised, acts really jaded kind of character who, despite being young, thinks she's acting more mature than she actually is. The execution is different enough that I wouldn't just call her a copy. Naota's jadedness expressed itself as a bit of passive-aggressive hostility in some ways. Hidomi is just completely closed off. However, as of this particular first episode, that's the most interesting thing I can say about anything in FLCL Progressive. Yeah, this doesn't quite feel like a good first episode to carry on the title, I have to be honest. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, of course. There are plenty of series out there, anime or otherwise, that have lackluster beginnings, or even bad beginnings, but turn out great by the end. Still, though, if you were to compare the first episode of FLCL Progressive to the first episode of FLCL Original, well, there's no contest as to which one makes the better first impression. The first episode of the original FLCL pretty much grabs you from the beginning. It's quirky for like the first 10 minutes, and then as soon as Haruko Haruhara shows up, it goes into insane territories. The first episode of FLCL Progressive never quite gets to that level. Granted, Haruko doesn't really show up in a proper sense until the very end of the episode, so maybe episode 2 is where things devolve into insanity, and I mean that in a good way, but still, it feels as if something is just off. And what feels off is the restraint. FLCL Progressive, first episode at least, feels oddly restrained, as opposed to the first episode of the original, which was completely unrestrained. Again, that might just be first episode syndrome, I don't know. But I still have to ask, is it possible FLCL Progressive shouldn't even exist? Or that maybe it shouldn't have been a FLCL sequel? The thing you have to understand about FLCL, for those of you who are newer to this whole anime thing, is that FLCL originally existed just as an excuse for Studio Gainax to try out new styles of animation. They happened to add a lot of thematic elements to it, but otherwise it was just an excuse for them to do whatever the heck they wanted. And they did just that. FLCL is randomness personified in animated form, and it works because of that. The fact that it became somewhat of a global phenomenon, at least in otaku culture, was really just plain old luck. And yet, a phenomenon it became. Its particular brand of insanity was something that appealed to otaku culture. But that's also because Fooly Cooly was such a singular series. There's no other anime quite like it. No matter how crazy a comedy it may be, Fooly Cooly still remains unique. So the problem that comes from making a sequel is the same problem that comes from trying to capture lightning in a bottle the second time. How are you going to do it? How do you make another series that strikes that perfect balance between random insanity and thematic strength? The first episode of Progressive doesn't quite do that. It recreates a few moments from the first series, but doesn't quite do them in a way that feels natural compared to that first time. The animated style never really changes in any particular way. Oddly enough, this one seems to actually have a plot, which is kind of weird because Fooly Cooly original series had no plot to speak of. There were a sequence of events that happened, yes, but that wasn't really what I would call a story. But most of all, it just wasn't strange enough. And I cannot emphasize how important being strange is to Fooly Cooly. Whether it's a scene suddenly being portrayed by manga pages, or someone coming out of nowhere to whack you in the head with a bass guitar, or robots popping out of somebody's head, or whatever might happen, strangeness is central to what makes Fooly Cooly work. Of course, all that stuff was unexpected the first time. It happens again in this sequel series, at least in episode 1, but this time it was expected. I think that might be part of the problem. It did what we expected as opposed to what we did not expect. When the strangest thing I can think of about this first episode is how some overweight kid was delivering a speech about how it's not strange that he's wearing a ridiculously short skirt in public, I'm sorry, I can't help but feel that the point was missed somewhere. Again, it's only the first episode, so who knows what's planned. Studio Gainax has been known to play with metafiction before, so maybe this lackluster first episode was 100% intentional. Still, though, it didn't leave the same impression on me that the first episode of the original series did. It is therefore my sincere hope that things improve. We will certainly see what happens.